Yanamasata Kurobo Sutu. Abba Yahweh says to teach my children how to acknowledge my truth. He says in every spectrum. So he says the vile effects of the enemy, the intrusions, he says. He says the instigations on every side. He says they need to be curtailed. He says to demonstrate to them the effects. He says the woes. He says the principles, the precepts that need to go ahead. And how they need to stand in these situations to help their loved ones. He says encourage them. He says that a grateful heart is the reward for many. I'm going to repeat that. Abba Yahweh says a grateful heart is the reward for many. He says this is a strategy that needs to be used amongst the people. He says incessantly. He says being grateful for every opportunity. He says even if the enemy is advancing. He says being grateful is a key component. He says because it enlightens your darkness. He says it helps you to see it from my perspective. He says when you see it as a chore, he says when you see it as ruthless, he says it will not come to fruition. He says the strategy is to be grateful. He says, use my keys. He says, my keys of obedience is the number one strategy, he says. He says, I will reward you for standing in the gap. He says, for training others, I will reward you. He says, I will keep you uplifted. He says, I will give you breath in your lungs. He says, I will breathe upon your situations and your circumstances. He says, I will bring a great turnaround. He says, in the development. He says, in the proceedings. He says, in sure-footedness. He says, I will remove every arrow, he says. He says, I will remove the diabolic trends. He says, the egotistical ways. He says, I will dry them up. He says, as I move, as I have my being, he says, my word will be acknowledged right there before you, he says. He says, right there in the midst of the circumstance. He says to engage children. He says, engage in these precepts. He says it is a warning. He says, warning signs. He says, engage. He says, engage in the battle. And he says, watch the shifts. He says, watch the moves. He says, as I meditate ahead of you. He says, I'm opening doors. He says the enemy won't see. He says, I'm encompassing you on every side. He says, I will make a way where there seems to be no way. He says, in trusting me, you will win. He says, I will be your guide. I will be your helper. Again, he says, engage children. He says, engage in the warfare that I've placed in front of you. He says, because I am leading you. He says, the battle will be won. He says, it's not their strategy that overrides it. He says, in the midst of it, I'm bringing about fruitfulness, he says. He says, in the midst of it, I'm engaging my warriors. He says, great turnarounds, children. He says, as my spirit goes ahead of you, he says, I will be your God. He says, the maker of everything. He says, in the transitions, I will guide you. He says, my sure-footedness will be your guide. He says, it will be a shield and a buckler to you. Again, Daddy says, engage children. He says, engage in the wars I've set before you. He says, these great battles will be won by me, he says. Again, he says, I am the maker of everything. And again, he says, I go before you. Hallowed be your name, Father. Oh, we thank you, Abba Yahweh. Oh, we thank you for the encouragement. Oh, we needed that so much, Abba. We needed that so much. We needed to hear that. Your children needed to hear that. May it not fall upon deaf ears, Father, but may it accomplish that which you set up for it to accomplish. We love you, we praise you, and we thank you in your holy and matchless name, Selah. Yamen, yamen, and yamen. Oh, Abba Yahweh is so good to us, is he not, children?